I'm going to talk to you about Edward James Hughes. He is known as Ted Hughes. His first volume of poetry that established him came out in 1957. I told you that Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes were living in Massachusetts, teaching at the university there, writing poetry. But Ted Hughes felt very unhappy in the United States, and they came back to London in 1957. And after spending some time in London and other places, they went to Devon to live there. And it was there that their first child was born. Their daughter was born, Rebecca. Soon after, Sylvia Plath gave birth to a son. And while she was busy taking care of the babies, they had a visitor in their family called Assia Weville. David Weville was her third husband. She had married one Roger Lipsey. You might have heard about him. He was professor of economics at the London School of Economics. And she had a great potential for falling in love with men. Just as Ted Hughes had a great potential for falling in love with women. So she saw David Weville. He was a Canadian poet. He got an assignment in the University of Mandalay in Burma. He went to teach there, and Assia joined him. She divorced her husband and married Weville. There Assia learned Balinese dance, and she was also some sort of a poet. When they came back to London, apparently Sylvia knew her, and she came to live with them. And there, while Sylvia was taking care of the children, she was breastfeeding her son. Hughes's biographer, Feinston, tells us that she was not much interested in sex, and Ted fell in love with Assia. And Sylvia was a highly emotional being. She could not bear it. And she drove Ted out of her home. And Ted went and lived with Assia. And they married. And Sylvia took her 2 children and began to live in London. This was in 1962. 1963 winter was very harsh. Sylvia felt lonely, and she committed suicide by turning on the gas in her kitchen, and she asphyxiated herself to death, as the doctors would call it. Feminists were very angry, on both sides of the Atlantic, in Great Britain as well as America, were very angry with Ted Hughes. And Hughes could not face, and he avoided poetry reading sessions because women would boycott him or they would call him murderer. But even with Assia, the relationship could not last very long, because Ted was meeting other women. And in 1969, exactly 6 years after Sylvia Plath had committed suicide, Assia murdered their daughter Shura. Shura was the name of their daughter. She murdered their daughter and then committed suicide the same way as Sylvia had committed suicide. That was in 1969. In the beginning, people didn't know how Ted felt after the death of his first daughter, after the death of his first wife, that is Sylvia Plath. But he was slow in writing his poetry. And in 1967, because you would recall that Ted Hughes was a prolific poet, was a prolific writer. He translated works of foreign authors. He wrote for children. With Seamus Heaney, the Nobel laureate, he prepared anthologies of verse. So he was working very, very hard. But we find that there is a gap of about 7 years between 1960, when Lupercal was published, and 1967, when Vaudevaux was published. I will read out this poem called Vaudevaux, or Voodoo, whichever way you pronounce it, which shows in itself how he transforms his uncertainty, lack of balance, lack of equipoise into poetry. Voodoo has a few question marks, but by and large the punctuation marks are missing. William Carlos Williams, Robert Lowell, Olson had not become popular in Great Britain by then. And the English reading public was not prepared to receive the kind of language that Ted Hughes was writing in Voodoo. Notice the questioning. Voodoo. What am I? The poem begins, Voodoo begins. What am I? nosing here, turning leaves over, following a faint stain on the air to the river's edge. I enter water. What am I to split the glassy grain of water looking upward? I see the bed of the river above me, upside down, very clear. What am I doing here in midair? Why do I find this frog so interesting as I inspect its most secret interior and make it my own? Why do I find this frog so interesting as I inspect its most secret interior and make it my own? Frogs are not the most attractive of creatures. Do these weeds know me and name me to each other? Have they seen me before? Do I fit in their world? I seem separate from the ground and not rooted, but dropped out of nothing casually. I seem separate from the ground and not rooted, but dropped out of nothing casually. I have no threads fastening me to anything. I can go anywhere. I seem to have been given the freedom of this place what am I then? Is he Adam in the Garden of Eden? And picking bits of bark off this rotten stump gives me no pleasure and is no use, so why do I do it? Me and doing that have coincided very queerly. But what shall I be called? Am I the first? Have I an owner? That shape, am I what? Shape, am I huge if I go? Shape, am I huge if I go? To the end on this way past these trees and past these trees, till I get tired just touching one wall of me for the moment. If I sit still, how everything stops to watch me. I suppose I am the exact center. But there's all this. What is it? Roots, 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 and here's the water, again very queer, but I'll go on looking. The poem doesn't end with a period. It's like a voice from nowhere. Because the man narrating it does not know who he is, why he is there. In his loneliness he feels that all the objects around him are looking at him. I seem separate from the ground and not rooted, but dropped out of nothing casually. I seem separate from the ground and not rooted, but dropped out of nothing casually. I have no threads fastening me to anything. I can go anywhere. I seem to have been given the freedom of this place. What am I then? Voodoo comes from a character in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is half man, half beast in the shade. You would remember the character in the story of Prahlad. You would notice that there is violence of Hiranyakashipu being destroyed by another kind of violence. Ted Hughes thought that Western civilization, since Plato was on its decline. Why was it on its decline? Ted Hughes thought that the West had given prominence, given greater importance to the intellect compared with the animal instinct within us. What is this animal instinct? This depredacious animal instinct of survival, of sex, of gaining wealth, power, prestige. And for these things, in order to acquire power, prestige, money, and women, we commit all kinds of crime. And Ted Hughes doesn't condemn them. He just observes them. Like a scientist, he portrays them, portrays human beings as they are. And not only human beings, the animal world is hardly different. Hughes is trying to understand humanity through the animal world. He understands humanity. He can see the basic instinct. He can see nature within human beings. He can see nature in animal, in birds, in beasts, in insects. So voodoo is representation of, perhaps, the uncertainty, the loss of equipoise, the loss of ground, as it were, that Hughes felt after Sylvia Plath committed suicide. They had been divorced for more than a year when she committed suicide. Hughes had been living with Assia when Sylvia committed suicide, and still it had an effect. Hughes did not speak anything about his relationship with Sylvia until the last work, that is called Birthday Letters, which was published in 1998, which told the world about the emotional side of Ted Hughes. But Ellen Feinstein, the biographer, Ted Hughes' biography came out in 2002, shows that it was because of Ted Hughes' promiscuity, Ted Hughes' inability, complete inability to confine himself to one woman, and because of his propensity for making sex with many women, that Sylvia committed suicide. Sylvia had a fragile character, an emotional character, who could not put up with that kind of a man. Hughes must have been terrible in this sense, because even his second wife had to commit suicide. In 1970, Hughes married for a third time. This time to a nurse, Carol Orchard, and still he had extramarital sex. There is a significant poem by Hughes which is called A Childish Prank. A Childish Prank. Listen to this poem. Man's and woman's bodies lay without souls. We have just read a poem in which we get the impression of Adam being all alone in the Garden of Eden. Now notice how sex was created, how we gained sexuality. A childish prank. Man's and woman's bodies lay without souls, dully gaping, foolishly staring, inert on the flowers of Eden. God pondered. The problem was so great, it dragged him asleep. God had created Adam and Eve, but they didn't know what to do with one another. And God felt that there was some flaw in his creation, because Adam and Eve are not gelling together. Man's and woman's bodies lay without souls, dully gaping, foolishly staring, inert on the flowers of Eden. God pondered. The problem was so great, it dragged him asleep. Crow laughed. He bit the worm, God's only son, into two writhing halves. There was a worm in the garden, and there was a crow on the tree. And when it saw Adam and Eve, it hit upon a plan. It cut the worm into two halves. One would naturally be the side of the head, and the other would be the side of the tail. He stuffed into man the tail half with the wounded end hanging out. He stuffed into man the tail half. The tail half was stuck into the man with the wounded end hanging out. He stuffed the head first into woman. He stuffed the head first, so the head of the worm was above. In the case of the man, it was the cut half, the wounded half that was outside. The whole half, the complete half, was within the body of man. He stuffed the head first into woman, and it crept in deeper and up to peer out through her eyes, calling its tail half to join up quickly, because it was painful. Now, the head half of the body in the woman, the tail half of the worm in the man, wanted to meet. So you have it. He's to peer out through her eyes, calling its tail half to join up quickly, quickly, because, oh, it was painful. Man awoke being dragged across the grass in Eden. Woman awoke to see him coming. Neither knew what had happened. Now they had a mind, Adam and Eve. And they suddenly realized that something strange was happening to them. They were running across the grass to meet. God went on sleeping. Crow went on laughing. This is a beautiful poem. And Ted Hughes succeeds in pointing out his main idea, the idea of sexuality, the idea of violence going with sexuality, the idea of creation, of beauty, going with this violence, the idea of war and the idea of peace, the idea of love and the idea of hatred go hand in hand. Edwin Muir was a senior poet who, when he saw The Hawk in the Rain in 1957, he admired it immensely, and he said there is admirable violence in his poetry. Admirable violence. Hughes is not like a priest giving out sermons. Hughes is content to portray with utter sincerity. And here you have, in a childish prank, this utterly simple, somewhat humorous, but a soul-satisfying poem. Man's and woman's bodies lay without souls, dully gaping, foolishly staring, inert on the flowers of Eden. God pondered. The problem was so great, it dragged him asleep. Crow laughed. He bit the worm, God's only son, into two writhing halves. He stuffed into man the tail half with the wounded end hanging out. He stuffed the head half head first into woman, and it crept in deeper and up to peer out through her eyes, calling its tail half to join up quickly, quickly, because, oh, it was painful. Man awoke being dragged across the grass. Woman awoke to see him coming. Neither knew what had happened. God went on sleeping. Crow went on laughing. Now, I would read a poem called Little Blood. Little Blood is again, who it refers to is not absolutely clear. What it means, we will have to understand when we read the poem. Little Blood is a favorite poem of Seamus Heaney. When he died, in 1998, Seamus Heaney was present at the funeral and spoke emotionally about Hughes. He said, "No death outside my immediate family has left me feeling more bereft. No death in my lifetime has hurt poets more. He was a tower of tenderness and strength, a great ark under which the least of poetry's children could enter and feel secure. His creative powers were, as Shakespeare said, still crescent. His creative powers were, as Shakespeare said, still crescent. By his death, the veil of poetry is rent and the walls of learning broken. By his death, the veil of poetry is rent and the walls of learning broken." So, Little Blood is a favorite poem of Seamus Heaney. Listen to this poem. "O little blood, hiding from the mountains in the mountains, wounded by stars and leaking shadow, eating the medical earth." Notice the image. Eating the medical earth. "O little blood, little boneless, little skinless, ploughing with a linnet's carcass, reaping the wind and threshing the stones. O little blood, drumming in a cow's skull, dancing with a gnat's feet, with an elephant's nose, with a crocodile tail, grown so wise, grown so terrible, sucking death's mouldy tits, sucking death's mouldy tits. Sit on my finger, sing in my ear, O little blood." Is he describing a mosquito? I can't recall another poet, either in English or in any of the languages that I know, where a poet might have written about a mosquito. "Sit on my finger, sing in my ear, O little blood." The noise that mosquitoes make are some of the most unpleasant of experiences. Their bites are hardly something that you look forward to. But Heaney liked the poem, and Ted Hughes does not express his dislike for this creature. Notice the grand background against which he presents the mosquito. "O little blood, hiding from the mountains in the mountains, wounded by stars and leaking shadow, eating the medical earth." Where does the mosquito sit? In cesspools, on dirty waters. That is where they lay their eggs. "O little blood, little boneless, little skinless, ploughing with a linnet's carcass, reaping the wind and threshing the stones." If a mosquito has had a good drink of your blood, it turns red. If you still it. It is only blood that splashes around, and the body, as it were, vanishes. Oh, little blood drumming in a cow's skull, dancing with a gnat's feet, with an elephant's nose, with a crocodile's tail. With an elephant's nose. It sucks your blood with a straw, as it were, just as you suck a cold drink. So it sucks blood out of your body, and he is comparing this part of his body with the nose, the trunk of an elephant, with an elephant's nose, with a crocodile's tail, dancing with a gnat's feet. Hughes looks at the joy, the happiness that the insect, this mosquito, represents, dancing with a gnat's feet, drumming in a cow's skull, with an elephant's nose, with a crocodile's tail, grown so wise, grown so terrible. Think of the war of the Mahabharata. Think of all the wisdom that they preached. Recall figures such as Bhishma Pitama or Kripacharya. Or Guru Drona, and still assembled to deny the 5 brothers their rights. How can you see beauty there? And still, Vyas could portray them because he could see beauty in places where most of us see ugliness. In fact, that ugliness is also within us. Beauty and ugliness, as it were, go hand in hand. And the poet is not a preacher. He does not tell us what is good and what is bad. He tells us the state of our being, as Heidegger would have put it. Poetry tells us, poetry locates us in our being, in our essence. That what we are, we as ourselves, we in our being, and we in our becoming. We are not something fixed. We keep changing under the impulse of our environment. And the mosquito is a symbol of our being and our becoming in aspects so sublime, and yet so depredacious. Grown so wise, grown so terrible, sucking death's mouldy tips, Tits is the nipple from which a child sucks his mother's milk. The child is depredacious, and there is both beauty and ugliness in the same act. Here, the mosquito is sucking death's moldy tits, tits that are moldy, tits that are not fresh. Sit on my finger, sing in my ear, O little blood. It's a beautiful poem about ugliness. In 1970, Ted Hughes published his most famous work that was called Crow. Crow had been his favorite symbol for many years, and he used the image of the crow in many of his poems. I would read out Crow's Fall for you. When Crow was white, he decided the sun was too white. He decided it glared much too whitely. He decided to attack it and defeat it. He got his strength up flush and in full glitter. He clawed and fluffed his rage up. He aimed his beak direct at the sun's center. He laughed himself in the center of himself and attacked. At this battle cry, trees grew suddenly old. Shadows flattened. But the sun brightened. It brightened, and Crow returned charred black. He opened his mouth, but what came out was charred black. Up there, he managed, where white is black and black is white. I won. It is not the victory that counts. It is the spirit that matters. The sun, the crow in the eyes of the world might have been defeated by the sun. But notice the final words, the definitive words of the crow. I won. Hughes used the image of the crow in a variety of ways, in kaleidoscopic ways. And his memory finally probably is going to rest in the minds of millions of his readers for this image of the crow. Thank you.